Hank, a middle-aged, experienced truck driver, is known for his determination and skepticism. He has traversed countless roads throughout his life, facing storms, long nights, and even the dangers of the highway, but he never paid attention to the stories from other drivers about haunted roads or urban legends. For Hank, the only thing that matters is the job, delivering the cargo on time and getting home safely. On a dark, moonless night, Hank receives a new mission, an urgent delivery that needs to be made to a distant town on the other side of the state. He doesn't like driving at night, but the pay is good, and he's determined to complete the task. With the truck loaded and the GPS set, Hank sets out for what he believes will be just another routine trip. As the night progresses, the road before him becomes increasingly deserted. The city lights and the occasional roadside houses disappear in the rearview mirror, leaving Hank alone with the hum of the engine and the dark asphalt that seems to stretch infinitely ahead of him. To stay alert, he turns on the radio, but all he can tune into is static and old songs that only heighten the sense of isolation. After hours of driving, Hank realizes something is wrong. He should have passed through a small town half an hour ago, but there's no sign of civilization anywhere. The GPS starts to fail, displaying only a blank map with no defined roads. Still skeptical, Hank tries to restart the device, but without success. He decides to trust his instincts and keep moving forward, believing he'll eventually find a way out. Suddenly, without warning, a dense fog begins to form around the truck. It appears out of nowhere, covering the road and the surrounding landscape, obscuring Hank's view. He slows down, trying to see through the fog that seems to swallow everything around him. The radio begins to emit a low, disturbing hum, as if it's picking up something it shouldn't. It's then that Hank spots an old sign by the side of the road. The sign, made of old, rusted wood, is barely legible, but he manages to make out the words "Lost Road" engraved on it. Next to the sign, a side road that he swears wasn't there before appears in the mist, as if it had materialized out of thin air. Hank hesitates. He's heard stories about the lost road, a road that, according to legend, only appears to those destined never to return. But as always, he dismisses these stories as nonsense, superstitions of tired drivers. However, the road before him is intriguing, almost as if it's calling out to him. Convinced it's just an alternate route and that his GPS is wrong, Hank decides to take the side road. He turns the wheel and enters the lost road, not knowing that by doing so, he's crossing the threshold into a world where the rules of reality no longer apply. The road seems endless, with the fog thickening with each mile he travels. The silence is oppressive, and the darkness surrounding Hank is total, except for the truck's headlights, which illuminate only a few meters ahead. He tries to tune the radio again, but all he hears are indistinct whispers that seem to be speaking directly to him. Tension builds inside Hank, but he refuses to give in to fear. After all, he's a practical man, an experienced driver who doesn't get rattled by horror stories. But deep down, something starts to change. He feels like he's being watched, as if the road itself is alive, aware of his presence. Throughout this first part, the atmosphere of tension and mystery is established, setting the stage for the terrifying events to come. The lost road has already trapped Hank in its path, and there's no turning back. Hank's truck continues down the lost road, with the dense fog making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The trees, once visible along the roadside, are now just distant shadows, as if the very vegetation is retreating, leaving Hank completely isolated. He feels the weight of absolute silence, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the asphalt and the occasional creaking of distant trees. As he continues driving, Hank begins to notice that time seems to be stretching. He looks at the dashboard clock, which has marked the same time since he entered the road. The GPS, still without a signal, displays only a blank screen. He tries to speed up, but the road seems endless, and the fog only becomes thicker, almost tangible. As tension mounts, Hank begins to question his own sanity. He considers calling someone, but when he picks up his cell phone, he sees there's no signal, just a blank screen. The sense of isolation grows, and for the first time in years, Hank feels a chill run down his spine. He wonders if he should have listened to the stories of other drivers, if he should have taken a different route. But it's too late to turn back. Suddenly, a sharp, distorted sound begins to emanate from the truck's radio. It's interference he's never heard before, as if several voices are speaking at once, in a language he can't understand. Hank tries to turn off the radio, but the button seems unresponsive. The sound continues, intensifying until it abruptly stops, leaving an even more oppressive silence. It's at this moment that Hank sees something ahead, barely visible through the thick fog. He slows down the truck and realizes there's a figure by the side of the road. What appears to be a man, standing still, dressed in old, tattered clothes. The stranger raises his hand as if hitchhiking. Hank, with his heart pounding, hesitates but instinctively slows down. As he gets closer, Hank notices something strange. The man appears to have no face, just a shadow where his features should be. The figure begins to move toward the truck, and Hank, gripped by inexplicable fear, floors the accelerator, speeding past the figure that vanishes into the fog as if it had never been there. Panic seizes Hank. He looks in the rearview mirror but sees nothing but the empty road. What did he see? A trick of his tired mind? A reflection in the fog? Hank tries to convince himself it was just an illusion, but the discomfort lingers. He knows something is deeply wrong with that road. A few minutes later, Hank spots something even more disturbing in the distance, the rusted gates of a cemetery. The cemetery seems to have been forgotten by time, with moss-covered tombstones surrounded by dead trees. He can't understand how there could be a cemetery on a road that supposedly doesn't exist. Feeling compelled to investigate, Hank decides to stop the truck beside the cemetery entrance. He turns off the engine, and the silence around him is deafening. Against his better judgment, he feels an inexplicable attraction to that place, as if some invisible force is calling him. As he steps out of the truck, Hank notices the temperature has dropped dramatically. The air is cold, and the fog around him seems to come alive, moving supernaturally. Each step toward the cemetery gates is accompanied by a dull echo, as if the ground beneath is hollow. When Hank finally crosses the gates, he feels a shiver run down his spine. The cemetery is vast, with endless rows of old tombstones, many so worn that the inscriptions are illegible. But as he ventures deeper, Hank begins to make out words etched into the tombstones, names and dates that seem familiar but impossible. Then he sees a tombstone that stops him in his tracks. The name engraved on it is his own, Hank Miller, followed by a death date that matches today's. Hank, incredulous and terrified, steps back, stumbling over a protruding root. He tries to rationalize what he's seeing, but his heart is racing, and the sense of imminent danger grows with each passing second. The voice from the radio, now turned off, begins to sound again in the night silence. A low, continuous whisper seems to emanate from the cemetery's very shadows. Hank, overcome with fear, runs back to the truck, but when he tries to start the engine, he realizes it's completely dead, as if drained by something in that place. The road that doesn't exist has drawn him into a nightmare, and Hank now finds himself trapped in a cemetery that defies all the laws of reality. He's alone, surrounded by tombstones that whisper ancient secrets, and his only hope is to find a way out before time, or something much more sinister, ends him. Hank sits in the driver's seat, his hands trembling as they grip the steering wheel tightly. The truck, once a reliable machine, is now inert, as if it had been drained of all its vital energy. He tries to start the engine once more, but all he hears is the dry, repetitive sound of a system that refuses to function. The reality of his situation begins to solidify in his mind. He's trapped in that place, on that road that shouldn't exist, beside a cemetery that seems to have been pulled from the pages of a nightmare. Outside the truck, the dense fog moves like a living entity, winding around the tombstones and twisted trees of the cemetery. The air is heavy and cold, as if the very atmosphere is saturated with the weight of ancient, forgotten secrets. Every breath Hank takes seems to carry an echo from the past, a dark memory of something he shouldn't know. He hesitates to leave the truck again, but the need to understand what's happening and perhaps find a way out forces him to make a decision. With a deep breath, Hank opens the truck door and steps out. The feeling of being watched is intense. and he has the distinct impression that the cemetery's invisible eyes are fixed on him. Walking toward the cemetery's iron gate, Hank feels a chill run down his spine. The gate, once imposing, is now rusted and falling apart, as if it had been abandoned centuries ago. He pushes the gate with difficulty, hearing the sharp sound of corroding metal as it moves. The sound echoes in the deathly silence that reigns around, making him flinch. Inside the cemetery, Hank notices the tombstones are arranged haphazardly, as if they had been thrown there by a chaotic and vengeful force. He begins to walk among them, his footsteps echoing softly on the damp ground. Each tombstone he passes seems to tell a story, though most are so worn he can barely read the names. However, a sense of familiarity washes over him, as if he's been there before, though he knows it's impossible. As he ventures deeper into the cemetery, Hank comes across an imposing mausoleum at the center of the grounds. The structure, built from dark stone and covered in moss, exudes an aura of power and fear. He feels a strange compulsion to approach, as if something inside the mausoleum is calling to him. As he gets closer, Hank notices the mausoleum door is slightly ajar, with a faint, flickering light emanating from within. He hesitates, his heart pounding in his chest, but his curiosity, mixed with a desperate need for answers, pushes him forward. Pushing the door open cautiously, Hank enters the mausoleum. The air inside is heavy, saturated with the smell of mold and something else, something he can't identify but that makes his skin crawl. The flickering light comes from a series of old candles arranged around a stone altar in the center of the room. Surrounding the altar are carved dark figures, all depicting scenes of sacrifice and despair. But what really catches Hank's attention is the worn leather-bound book on the altar. It's thick, with yellowed pages that seem ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. On the cover, inscribed in old, faded letters, is the title, Diary of the Lost. Hank feels a chill as he reads these words, and without thinking, he reaches out to pick up the book. As he opens the first page, he sees the diary belonged to several truck drivers over the years, each leaving their last words there, trapped in the same situation as him. The writings are chaotic, as if each author was on the brink of insanity when they wrote. What Hank reads makes his blood run cold. Every trucker describes a road that doesn't exist, a cemetery forgotten by time, and a presence that followed them until nothing was left of them. As he reads, Hank hears something moving in the shadows around the mausoleum. He stops, clutching the book tightly, and listens more intently. The sounds are soft, almost like whispers, but there's a malevolence in them that makes his breath quicken. He feels time is running out, that he needs to get out of there before it's too late. With the diary in hand, Hank runs out of the mausoleum, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Outside, the fog seems thicker, and the cold more intense. He realizes he needs to get back to the truck, but when he reaches the cemetery gate, something makes him stop. As he looks back, he sees a figure among the tombstones, almost indistinguishable in the fog, but unmistakable in its threatening presence. The figure stands still, watching him, without making any movement. Hank feels terror take hold of him, a sense that he's being drawn into a nightmare from which he won't be able to wake. With his heart racing, Hank runs toward the truck, jumping into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. He tries to start the engine once more, and this time, as if by a miracle, the truck responds, roaring back to life. Hank floors the accelerator, the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt as he speeds away from the cemetery and the figure still watching him. As he drives down the road, the fog begins to dissipate, but Hank knows the danger isn't over. He now carries the diary of the lost truckers, and within it, perhaps the key to understanding and escaping the curse that trapped him in that place. But what he doesn't know is that the cemetery, and the road that led him there, are not just cursed places, they're part of something much larger, something that's just beginning to reveal its dark secrets. Hank's truck continues its course down the road, now with the engine running again, but something is different. The relief of escaping the cemetery quickly dissipates, giving way to a growing anxiety. He can't shake the image of the figure in the fog and what he read in the lost trucker's diary. Every word, every tale of terror and despair, is etched in his memory, and he knows he can't ignore what's happening. As Hank drives, he notices that the road ahead doesn't seem to move. It's as if he's trapped in an endless loop, where every mile traveled brings him back to the starting point. The landscape around him is unchanging, a bleak and empty wasteland offering no sign of life or an end. The radio, silent since he left the cemetery, suddenly comes to life, emitting static for a few seconds before turning into voices. These voices are indistinct at first, broken whispers mixed with the buzz of static. Hank tries to adjust the volume, but the static only grows louder, as if the radio is tuning into a channel that shouldn't exist. Then he begins to understand fragments of the words, names, pleas for help, and descriptions of places he's never seen, but that seem to be transmitting from somewhere very close. Help, lost, endless road. Hank feels a chill up his spine. He recognizes the desperate tones in the voices, they are the same descriptions he read in the diary. Truckers like him, who found the lost road and never returned. He tries to turn off the radio, but the power button doesn't respond. The voices continue, overlapping one another, creating a cacophony of agony and despair. Then, among the voices, he hears one that stands out. It's a calm voice, almost whispered, but with a frightening clarity. "Hank, you shouldn't be here." Hank freezes, recognizing his own name in the transmission. He looks around, but the road remains deserted, shrouded in shadows. The voice continues, "You must find the way, or you'll become part of this, like us." The voice is both familiar and terrifying. Hank tries to concentrate, trying to understand what the voice is trying to tell him. What is this? What does he need to find? He tries to think rationally, but fear and confusion begin to cloud his judgment. He feels that the road is alive, aware of his presence, and that it's toying with him, leading him wherever it pleases. Suddenly, the radio shuts off on its own, plunging the truck into absolute silence. Hank feels his heart racing, each beat echoing in his ears. He begins to question his sanity. Is all this really happening, or is his mind playing tricks on him? Trying to calm himself, Hank decides to grab the diary he found in the cemetery. He opens it again, this time more carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. As he reads, he realizes that all the truckers who recorded their experiences went through the same stages he did. First, the road, then the cemetery, and finally, the voices. All of them reported hearing the voices, and all, without exception, disappeared shortly afterward. One page, in particular, catches Hank's attention. It's filled with scribbles, as if the author had been writing frantically in their final moments. Among the scribbles, Hank can make out the following phrase: "The road leads to where the heart is. If you find the exit, you'll find yourself. Otherwise, you'll be lost forever." Hank tries to decipher what this means. Where the heart is, could the key to escaping this curse be something personal, something he's not seeing? He tries to remember important moments in his life, places he would consider where the heart is, but nothing seems to fit. He feels that time is running out, that he needs to solve the riddle before it's too late. As he concentrates on the diary, a new presence makes itself felt in the truck. Hank feels a chill, as if something or someone is sitting in the passenger seat. He turns his head slowly, and for a brief moment, sees the outline of a figure, an indistinct shadow, but undeniably present. The shock causes him to drop the diary, which falls to the cabin floor. When he looks back, the figure is gone. Hank takes a deep breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the fear is real, palpable. He feels that the presence hasn't left, it's just waiting, watching, as if testing his courage. The road ahead seems to stretch endlessly, and Hank begins to feel tired, more tired than he's ever been before. He knows he can't stop, that he needs to keep moving, but the lack of sleep and stress begin to take their toll. He considers pulling over and resting for a moment, but something inside him, perhaps a survival instinct, prevents him. As he continues driving, Hank begins to hear the whispers again, this time weaker, but more personal. They speak of his fears, his failures, of things he tried to forget. The road isn't just trying to scare him, it's trying to break him, to destroy his will to resist. He knows he must find a way out before this happens, but every mile he travels seems to take him deeper into an endless nightmare. Hank is in a race against time, and the road, with its voices in the darkness, is determined to win. Time seems to have lost meaning for Hank as he continues his journey down the lost road. Fatigue now weighs on his shoulders like an impossible burden to bear, and his eyes burn with exhaustion. Every mile he travels is a battle against sleep, but he knows that stopping is not an option. Something inside him warns that giving into exhaustion would be fatal. As the road's darkness envelopes him, the landscape around him becomes increasingly surreal. The trees, which were once mere indistinct shadows, now seem to be closing in, bending toward the road as if they were alive, as if they were trying to reach Hank as he passes. He tries to ignore these disturbing visions, but the feeling of being watched persists, making every moment more unbearable. Suddenly, something ahead catches Hank's attention. He squints, trying to make out what he's seeing through the thick fog and oppressive darkness. Slowly, a figure begins to take shape in the middle of the road. It's a woman, dressed in white, standing still on the asphalt. Her appearance is ethereal, almost translucent, and Hank feels a chill run down his spine as he realizes she seems to be waiting for him. The truck slows as Hank tries to decide what to do. Every instinct screams at him not to stop, to drive straight through, but something in the woman's expression forces him to hesitate. There's a deep sadness in her eyes, a despair he can't ignore. With his heart racing, Hank finally decides to stop the truck a few meters from the apparition. He watches the woman for a moment, waiting for her to move, to do something, but she remains still, just staring at him with those dark, melancholic eyes. Hank rolls down the truck's window, the cold night air flooding the cabin, and tries to speak to her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Hank's voice comes out shakier than he'd like. The woman continues to stare at him for a few seconds before slowly beginning to move toward the truck. Each step she takes is accompanied by a soft rustling sound, like the whisper of dry leaves being trodden. She seems to float more than walk, and the truck's dim headlights give her figure an almost ghostly appearance. When the woman finally reaches the side of the truck, Hank notices that she's unlike any other person he's ever seen. Her skin is pale, almost translucent, and her eyes seem empty, as if they're looking at something far beyond him. She raises her hand and touches the truck's door, leaving a damp mark on the glass, before finally speaking. "You shouldn't be here," she says, her voice low and melancholic, as if speaking from a very distant place. "This road is a path for the lost." Hank feels fear intensify within him. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The woman looks directly into Hank's eyes, and he feels as if he's being pulled into a bottomless abyss. "I was lost too," she replies, her voice now tinged with sadness. "This road, it feeds on despair. Those who come here never find their way back." Hank begins to feel panic taking over. He tries to move away from the window, but the woman's presence seems to hold him captive. "What do I do? How do I get out of here?" The woman lowers her gaze, and for a moment, Hank thinks she won't answer. But then, with an almost inaudible sigh, she finally says, "You must follow your heart, but know that it may not lead you where you expect. There's a price to pay, and few are willing to pay it." Before Hank can ask more, the woman begins to move away, slowly returning to the middle of the road. He tries to call her back, but his voice fails, stuck in his throat. Her figure begins to dissipate into the fog, and in a few seconds, she vanishes completely, as if she'd never been there. Hank remains stunned, trying to process what just happened. The woman's words echo in his mind, "Follow your heart, a price to pay." None of it makes sense, but he knows he has no choice but to keep moving. The road is still ahead of him, and although he doesn't know where it will lead, he feels that the answer he seeks is somewhere at the end of this path. With a deep sigh, Hank puts the truck back in motion. The road continues to stretch before him, with no sign of an end, and the darkness around him seems more oppressive than ever. He knows he must find a way out of there before the road consumes him, as it did to so many others before him. But deep down, Hank can't stop wondering what the woman meant by a price to pay. Is he willing to pay that price, whatever it may be, to escape the lost road? And more importantly, what does that price truly entail? These questions accompany him as he drives, the woman's figure still etched in his mind, a reminder of what the road is capable of. Hank knows that time is running out, and that he needs to find the exit before the road takes everything from him, his sanity, his soul, his life. Hank continues driving down the endless road, the sensation of being watched growing with each passing minute. The fog around the truck doesn't dissipate, and the darkness seems thicker than ever. The woman's words still echo in his mind, a price to pay. He can't stop wondering what that means, and more importantly, what the road expects to take from him. As the tension within Hank mounts, the road ahead begins to change. The asphalt, once smooth, now appears cracked and uneven, as if it's disintegrating. Hank grips the wheel tightly, trying to keep control of the truck as the cracks widen, revealing a black, barren land beneath. Suddenly, he spots something ahead that makes him slow down. Once again, the cemetery appears, but this time it's different. The iron gate, which he recognizes from his previous visit, is open, as if inviting him in. But now there's something more. In the faint light of the headlights, Hank sees several trucks parked along the entrance, all covered in dust and rust, as if they'd been there for years. Hank's heart races. He knows these trucks belong to the drivers who disappeared before him, the same ones whose stories he read in the mausoleum diary. He feels a knot in his stomach as he realizes that each of these trucks represents a life lost to the road. He doesn't want to be next. But something, an invisible force, compels him to stop. Hank parks the truck next to the others and steps out, the silence around him becoming almost deafening. The air is heavy, laden with the smell of earth and something else, something metallic and sweet that makes his skin crawl. He knows he needs to investigate, to find out what's really happening in that cemetery, even if the fear threatens to paralyze him. As he crosses the gate, Hank notices that the tombstones are now more visible, as if the fog is dissipating only within the cemetery's boundaries. Each tombstone seems sharper, more real, and he can read the names engraved on them clearly. He feels a chill down his spine as he recognizes the names of some of the missing truckers, the same ones whose voices he heard on the radio. They're all buried there, victims of the Lost Road curse. Hank continues walking, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He feels a presence around him, something watching him from the shadows between the tombstones. He knows he's not alone, but he can't see who, or what, is there. The fear begins to turn into panic, but he forces himself to keep going, driven by a desperate need for answers. In the center of the cemetery, Hank finds a large stone monument, different from any tombstone he's ever seen. It's an imposing obelisk, with ancient symbols carved into its surface, symbols he can't decipher. Around the base of the obelisk are several metal plaques, each with a trucker's name and date of death, all matching the day they disappeared on the road. Hank feels he's standing before something much older and more powerful than he could have imagined. He realizes this is the trucker's cemetery, the place where all those drawn by the Lost Road end up. He understands that it's not just a resting place for the dead, but an altar for something far more sinister. As he examines the obelisk, Hank hears a sound behind him, soft footsteps, but unmistakable. He turns quickly and sees a figure emerging from the shadows. It's the same woman he encountered on the road, but now she looks different. Her appearance is sharper, more real, but her eyes are still filled with sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she says again, her voice echoing in the silence. "But now that you are, there's no turning back." Hank feels panic rising. "What do you want from me? What is all this?" The woman looks at the obelisk, her expression full of pain. "This is the place where lost souls rest," she explains. "All those who were deceived by the road, all those who couldn't find their way back, are here. And now, you're part of this too." Hank shakes his head, refusing to accept what she's saying. "No. I'm not going to end up like them. I'm going to find a way out." The woman sighs, as if she's heard this before. "The road demands a price," she says softly. "If you want to leave, you'll have to pay with something you value more than anything else. The question is, are you willing to pay that price?" Before Hank can respond, the woman disappears, leaving him alone before the obelisk. He feels a wave of despair, but also a new determination. He knows he has to figure out what this price is and how he can pay it to escape the curse. Hank turns and begins to walk back to the truck, but he can't shake the feeling that the road is waiting for him, ready to demand its toll. He knows he's in a race against time, and that every moment that passes brings him closer to a fate he's not prepared to face. When Hank finally returns to the truck, he looks at the other abandoned vehicles around him. Each one represents a life that the road consumed, a story that ended in tragedy. He knows he needs to be different, that he needs to find a way to break the cycle. But he also knows the road won't make it easy for him, and that the worst is yet to come. With a heavy heart, Hank starts the truck and returns to the road, the feeling of being pulled into an endless abyss intensifying. He knows he needs to find out what the road really wants, or he'll end up like all the others, lost forever in the trucker's cemetery. Back in the truck, Hank tries to stay focused as he drives down the lost road. The silence around him is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic sound of tires on the worn asphalt. The woman's words echo in his mind, "The road demands a price, something you value more than anything else." Hank can't stop thinking about what that could mean, and what the road expects to take from him. As he moves forward, the road seems to change shape. What was once a simple, deserted highway now turns into a labyrinth of curves and forks, each leading to unknown places. Hank realizes that no matter which direction he chooses, he always ends up back at the same point, as if he's trapped in an endless loop. Despair begins to set in, but he knows giving in to fear will only make things worse. Hank decides to keep moving forward, ignoring the forks and focusing only on what's ahead. He drives for hours, maybe even days. Time has lost all meaning in that place. The road, once familiar and predictable, now seems like a living entity, shaping itself around Hank, guiding him wherever it pleases. Eventually, Hank spots something in the distance, a small wooden cabin, standing alone by the roadside. It looks out of place, as if it had been left there by accident. Hank feels a strange attraction to the cabin, as if it's a safe haven amid the chaos. He decides to stop the truck and investigate. As he approaches, Hank notices the cabin is in an advanced state of decay. The windows are broken, and the wood is rotten and covered in moss. However, there's something comforting about it, as if it's a place where he could find answers, or at least some rest. Cautiously, he pushes the door open and steps inside. The cabin's interior is simple, with few pieces of furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Hank sees an extinguished fireplace, an old sofa, and a table with a single chair. However, what really catches his attention is an old map hanging on the wall. He approaches it and realizes it's a detailed map of the lost road and the surrounding areas. The map is marked with strange symbols and annotations in a language Hank doesn't recognize. However, one of the annotations is in English, written in hurried handwriting, "The point of no return." The map indicates there's a point on the road where, once crossed, there's no going back. Hank feels a chill as he reads this. He doesn't know where that point is, but he has a feeling he's getting closer to it with each mile traveled. Next to the map, Hank finds a diary, similar to the one he found in the cemetery but with fewer pages. He opens it and begins to read. The pages are filled with accounts from other truckers who tried to escape the road but all failed. Each one mentions the point of no return, but none managed to pass it. Hank realizes that the price the road wants to exact may be linked to this point. He understands that if he wants to get out of there, he'll have to face whatever lies beyond that limit. He mentally prepares himself for what's to come, knowing he has no other choice. Before leaving the cabin, Hank decides to rest for a few minutes. He sits on the sofa and closes his eyes, but he's immediately assailed by disturbing visions, images of missing truckers, their souls trapped on the road, calling out to him, begging for help. Hank wakes up with a start, his heart racing. He knows he needs to get out of there, that the road is closing in on him, trying to break him. Hank returns to the truck, starting the engine with a renewed sense of determination. He knows time is running out, and he needs to reach the point of no return to have any chance of escape. He puts the truck in motion and returns to the road, the landscape around him now more distorted and surreal than ever. As he drives, Hank feels the road change again. The forks are now more frequent, each leading to places that seem impossible: cliffs, endless deserts, dense forests. He continues forward, ignoring the distractions, focused on finding the point of no return. Suddenly, the truck's radio turns on by itself, emitting static for a few seconds before a familiar voice comes through. It's the woman's voice, but this time, she sounds different, more desperate, more urgent. "Hank, you're almost there, but you must be prepared for what you'll find." Hank tries to respond, but the radio only continues with the static, refusing to transmit his voice. He feels a wave of frustration and fear, but he knows he can't stop now. He keeps driving, each mile more difficult than the last, each curve more dangerous. Finally, Hank sees something ahead, a line on the asphalt, marked by symbols similar to those on the cabin's map. He knows, instinctively, that this is the point of no return. The place where he'll have to pay the price to escape the road. He stops the truck before crossing the line, his heart pounding in his chest. He doesn't know what awaits him on the other side, but one thing is certain: he'll have to face his greatest fears and make a sacrifice to have any chance of getting out of there. He takes a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what comes next. With one last look at the map in his mind, Hank moves the truck forward, crossing the line and entering unknown territory, where the road and reality merge into something much darker and more dangerous. He knows there's no turning back now, only moving forward, no matter the cost. Hank takes a deep breath as the truck crosses the line marked on the asphalt, the point of no return. The air around him seems to change instantly. What was once a solitary, surreal road now transforms into something much more sinister. The atmosphere becomes oppressive, and the darkness seems to come alive, as if the shadows are moving, following Hank's every move. The truck's engine, which was working perfectly before, begins to falter. The engine sound becomes irregular, as if struggling to keep going, echoing in the sinister quiet of the road. Hank grips the wheel, his knuckles turning white, as he tries to keep control of the vehicle. He knows something is about to happen, something that will test his physical and mental limits. Suddenly, the road ahead starts to distort, as if space itself is bending in on itself. The trees along the road become elongated and grotesque forms, and the asphalt seems to melt, forming impossible patterns. Hank feels a wave of nausea, but he continues forward, determined to find out what the road wants from him. Then, ahead of him, he sees a figure standing in the middle of the road. It's the woman from before, but now her appearance is different. She no longer looks ethereal, now she's a solid figure, with eyes full of sadness and understanding that Hank can't decipher. She raises her hand, signaling him to stop. Hank obeys, hitting the brakes and bringing the truck to a sudden halt. He gets out of the cabin, the air around him cold as ice, and walks toward the woman. There's something imposing about her presence, as if she's a guardian of ancient secrets, and Hank feels he's about to learn the truth about the road and the price he must pay. "You've made it this far, Hank," she says, her voice low but laden with undeniable authority. "But to move forward, you must make a pact." Hank frowns. "A pact? What kind of pact?" The woman takes a step forward, her eyes piercing Hank's. "The road demands a sacrifice," she says. "Something you value more than anything else. If you want to escape from here, you must be willing to let go of it." Hank feels a chill run down his spine. He remembers her earlier words about the road feeding on despair. He tries to think about what she might be referring to. His truck? His life? But something tells him the sacrifice is something deeper, something beyond the physical. "How will I know what it is?" Hank asks, his voice full of uncertainty. The woman sighs, as if she's had this conversation many times before. "You already know, Hank. Deep down, you know what it is. Something you're afraid to lose, something that defines who you are. The road feeds on that, on your fear, your attachment. If you want to leave here, you must let it go." Hank feels a wave of despair. He tries to think of all the things important to him, but each thought only leaves him more confused. He looks at the woman, searching for some clue, but her eyes are inscrutable, impossible to read. "If I pay this price, will I be able to get out?" Hank asks, clinging to a thin thread of hope. The woman watches him for a long moment before answering. "Yes, you'll be able to leave," she says softly. "But the price is permanent. You won't be able to get it back. And you must be prepared to live with the consequences of this pact." Hank knows he has no other choice. He feels he's on the edge of an abyss, that the road is about to consume him if he doesn't do what's necessary. But he still doesn't know what he must sacrifice, and that terrifies him. The woman, sensing his hesitation, takes a step back and raises her hand again. "I'll show you," she says, and with a gesture, she points to the truck. Hank turns to look, and his eyes widen in horror. Inside the truck, sitting in the passenger seat, is a boy. The boy looks about 8 years old, with tousled hair and sad eyes. Hank recognizes the boy instantly. It's himself as a child. Hank's heart races. He remembers that boy, himself, and all the things he lost over the years. The innocence, the hope, the dreams he had before life hardened him. He feels a sharp pain in his chest, as if he's seeing something he should never have forgotten. "That's your sacrifice, Hank," the woman says, her voice now gentler but relentless. "You must let go of him, let go of who you were, what you hoped to be. If you continue to cling to that past, the road will keep you here forever. But if you let it go, you can move forward." Hank feels tears beginning to form in his eyes. He knows the woman is right. He knows he's been holding on to a version of himself that no longer exists, a hope that he could go back to being that boy before life broke him. But letting go of that, accepting that he'll never be that boy again, is almost unbearable. I don't know if I can," Hank murmurs, feeling more lost than ever. The woman steps closer and places a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You can, Hank. But it must be your choice. No one can do it for you." Hank looks at the boy in the truck, at his own innocent and hopeful eyes, and feels a crushing weight of sadness. He knows this choice will define the rest of his life, if he survives to have a life left. He must choose between clinging to who he was or letting go to become something new, something that can survive the road. With tremendous effort, Hank closes his eyes and takes a deep breath. He knows what he must do, but that doesn't make the decision any easier. He opens his eyes and takes one last look at the boy, at the version of himself he must leave behind. I'm ready," Hank finally says, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I let go. I let it go." The woman smiles sadly, and Hank feels the air around him begin to change again. The boy in the truck slowly disappears, like a mirage fading away, and Hank feels a void in his chest, but also a strange sense of relief. He knows he made the right choice, even though the cost was high. The road around him begins to transform again, the shadows retreating, the darkness dissipating. Hank looks at the woman, who nods, indicating that he can move forward. "You did what was necessary, Hank," she says, her voice now filled with a calm he hasn't felt in a long time. "Now, go. The road is ready to let you go." Hank returns to the truck, feeling exhausted but determined. He starts the engine, which now purrs smoothly, and puts the vehicle in motion. The road ahead is clear, and he feels that, for the first time, there's an end in sight. As Hank drives, the woman's voice echoes in his mind one last time, "Never look back, Hank. Keep moving forward." And he obeys, without looking back, leaving the road and everything it demanded of him behind. He doesn't know what the future holds, but he knows that, finally, he's free, even though he's left a part of himself behind. Hank continues driving down the road, the constant sound of the truck's engine providing a strange sense of comfort after the harrowing encounter with the woman. The road, now free of distortions and the labyrinth of impossible curves, seems to have stabilized. The shadows no longer move menacingly, and the landscape around him, though still desolate, feels less oppressive. However, Hank knows that the sacrifice he made, letting go of the young version of himself and all the dreams he carried, was just the beginning. The woman made it clear that he had to pay a price, and he did. But what she didn't mention was that the sacrifice wouldn't be the last test. As he drives, Hank feels a growing sense of unease. He's free to move forward, but something inside him tells him that the road still has one final challenge in store. He can't afford to let his guard down now. Suddenly, the truck's radio, which had remained silent since the last encounter with the woman, comes to life again. This time, the voice he hears isn't hers, but someone he never expected to hear, his own voice. But it's not the voice of the current Hank, it's the voice of young Hank, the boy he just sacrificed. "You think you can just leave me behind?" The voice echoes in the cabin, full of pain and anger that makes Hank shudder. "You think you can escape without consequences?" Hank feels a lump in his throat. He tries to turn off the radio, but as before, the buttons don't respond. The voice continues, each word piercing his mind like a knife. "You abandoned me," says the voice, now with a darker tone. "You let go of who you were, and now you're just an empty shell. How do you expect to survive without the part of you that had hope? Without the part that believed in something better?" Hank feels panic starting to take over. He tried to do what was necessary to escape, but now he realizes that the price he paid might have been greater than he imagined. He sacrificed a fundamental part of himself, the part that dreamed, that hoped for a better future. And without that, he's not sure who he is now. The road ahead begins to transform again, but this time, in a way that feels more personal. The dead trees along the road take on shapes that resemble human figures, figures that Hank recognizes. He sees his family, his childhood friends, all those he left behind over the years. They're all standing, looking at him with expressions of disappointment and sadness. "You always run away," says the voice on the radio, now sounding closer, as if young Hank is sitting beside him. "You always abandon those you love. And now, you're trying to run away from yourself." Hank grips the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He doesn't want to hear these words, but he knows they're true. He's spent his whole life running away, from responsibilities, from feelings, from people. And now, the road is forcing him to face that. "I didn't want to," Hank murmurs to himself, his voice trembling. "I just wanted to survive." Survive? The young voice laughs, a cruel and empty sound. "You survived, but at what cost? You've lost everything, Hank. You've lost yourself." The shadows along the road begin to close in, and Hank feels fear taking over. He tries to accelerate, but the truck doesn't respond. He's trapped, surrounded by his own regrets, by all the mistakes he made, by all the people he hurt or left behind. He realizes that the road isn't just demanding a physical sacrifice, it's demanding that he face everything he's avoided throughout his life. Everything he buried within himself, all the parts of his soul he tried to forget. The figures in the shadows start moving toward the truck, their faces blurred but unmistakably familiar. Hank sees his mother, whom he abandoned when he was young to follow his own path. He sees friends he betrayed, loves he let slip away. Each figure is a reminder of something he tried to bury, something that's now coming back to haunt him. "You must face this, Hank," the voice on the radio says, now sounding calmer, darker. "Or you'll be consumed by it." Hank feels tears starting to run down his face. He knows the road is right. He's spent his whole life running, but now there's nowhere left to run. He must face his demons or be destroyed by them. With a strength he didn't know he had, Hank stops the truck and gets out of the cabin. The figures in the shadows are now all around him, their faces filled with sadness and disappointment. He feels the road is alive, waiting to see what he'll do next. "I'm sorry," Hank whispers, looking at the figures. "I'm sorry for everything." The figures seem to pause for a moment, as if they're listening. Hank feels the weight of regret and guilt crushing him, but he doesn't look away. He faces each one of them, acknowledging what he did, acknowledging the pain he caused. "I can't change the past," he continues, his voice broken. "But I can try to be different. I can try to be better. I can try to fix what I did." The figures begin to disappear, one by one, dissipating into the fog that surrounds the road. The weight on his chest begins to lift, but he knows it's not over yet. He must forgive himself, he must accept that he's imperfect but that he can still change. "I accept who I am," Hank finally says, his voice firm but soft. I accept my mistakes, my failures. But I also accept that I still have time to do the right thing." With these words, the last figures vanish, and the road ahead clears. Hank feels a peace he hasn't experienced in years, a sense that, finally, he's in control of his own destiny. He returns to the truck, starts the engine, and this time, it roars back to life with renewed vigor. Hank puts the vehicle in motion, knowing that although he still has a difficult road ahead, he's ready to face it, and, more importantly, to face himself. The road is now clear, and Hank feels that he's finally free of the curse that trapped him for so long. He knows the sacrifice he made was great, but he also knows that what he gained, self-acceptance and the chance for a new beginning, was worth it. As he drives away from the lost road, Hank looks toward the horizon and sees the sun beginning to rise. For the first time in a long time, he feels hope. And he knows that, no matter what the future holds, he's ready to face it. The sun begins to peek over the horizon, bathing the road in a soft, golden light. Hank continues driving, feeling an inner peace he hasn't experienced in years. The terror of the lost road is still fresh in his memory, but he knows the worst is over. The road, which once seemed like an endless trap, now stretches before him as a path to redemption. As the truck moves forward, Hank notices the landscape around him beginning to change. The dry, twisted trees that once lined the road are now blooming, with green, vibrant leaves. The cracked and uneven asphalt becomes smooth and well-paved, as if leading Hank to a safe place, far from the darkness that tormented him. Hank feels a gentle breeze enter through the truck's open window, and for a moment, he closes his eyes, feeling the calm the road now offers. He knows the journey isn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he feels in control of his destiny. He's let go of the past, faced his inner demons, and now he's ready to start anew. As the sun rises higher in the sky, Hank spots something in the distance, a small town. It looks peaceful and welcoming, with houses lined up and quiet streets. He doesn't recognize the place, but he feels a strange attraction to it, as if it's where he's supposed to be. As he approaches, Hank notices a welcome sign by the roadside. "Welcome to Willow Creek," the sign says, in elegant letters. The sight of the town awakens a sense of déjà vu in Hank, but he can't pinpoint where it's from. He realizes that while the town's name is new to him, the place feels incredibly familiar, like a dream he's had countless times. Without a second thought, Hank decides to enter the town. He drives through the quiet streets, watching the people start their day. Shops are opening, children are going to school, and there's a sense of normality and tranquility that starkly contrasts with the chaos and fear he faced on the road. Hank feels a tug at his heart, a mix of relief and longing. He drives slowly, absorbing the town's atmosphere until he spots a small diner by the roadside. It's a simple place but welcoming, with a neon sign flashing the name Jenny's Diner. Hank feels an inexplicable need to stop there, as if it's the right place to take a break and reflect on everything that's happened. Parking the truck, Hank gets out and walks toward the diner. The smell of fresh coffee and newly made pancakes envelopes him, and he realizes he's hungry, both physically and emotionally. He opens the door and steps inside, the sound of a small bell announcing his arrival. Inside, the atmosphere is cozy and simple. A few people are sitting at tables, talking softly. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, waves at him. "Good morning," she says. "What can I get for you?" Hank hesitates for a moment, still adjusting to the normalcy of the situation, then replies, "A black coffee, please. And maybe some pancakes." The waitress smiles and writes down the order. Hank sits at a table near the window, where he can watch the quiet street. As he waits, he looks around the diner, feeling increasingly comfortable. It's as if he's finally home, in a place where he can find the peace he's been searching for. When the coffee and pancakes arrive, Hank thanks the waitress and starts eating. Each bite seems to bring back a piece of his humanity, each sip of coffee warms him from the inside out. He realizes the road brought him here for a reason, to give him a new chance at life, to find the peace and redemption he didn't know he needed. After finishing the meal, Hank leans back in his chair, feeling satisfied and calm. He looks at the truck parked outside and realizes that, Although his journey was long and difficult, it brought him exactly where he needed to be. He doesn't know what the future holds, but he's ready to face it, knowing he's now in control of his life. As Hank prepares to leave the diner, the waitress approaches with a curious look. "You're new around here, aren't you?" she asks, smiling. Hank smiles back, feeling a new confidence within him. "Yes, I just got here. I've been on the road for a long time, but I think I've found the right place." She nods, seeming to understand more than she lets on. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for in Willow Creek. It's a quiet town, a good place to start over." Hank thanks her and leaves a generous payment on the table before stepping outside. When he steps out of the diner, he feels the warm sun on his face and takes a deep breath, savoring the fresh morning air. He walks over to the truck, but this time, he doesn't feel the urgency to keep going. Instead, he looks around the town and realizes that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, he doesn't need to keep running. He decides he'll stay in Willow Creek for a while. Maybe this is where he can finally find peace, where he can rebuild his life without the weight of the past haunting him. Hank knows the road will always be there, that it's part of him now, but he also knows the curse has been broken, and that he has the opportunity to be more than the man the road tried to destroy. With that thought, Hank walks away from the truck and begins to stroll through the town, ready to discover what the future holds. He doesn't look back because he knows there's nothing left for him there. The past is on the road, and now he's free to move forward. As the sun continues to rise in the sky, Hank feels a renewed sense of optimism. He's ready to start over, to live the life he always wanted but never had the courage to pursue. And, more importantly, he's ready to accept who he is, a man who survived the lost road and who now has the chance to create his own destiny.